Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval reconstruction. I'll try to keep this video compact, and I don't know how much this topic is interesting because personally I'm not extremely passionate about it, but we often talk about the importance that in fact other centuries and their interpretations of the Middle Ages have in our everyday life, in fact picturing medieval times. It's essentially very fascinating to observe how, especially the 19th century, renownedly played an enormous role in defining, in fact, this our own ideas of the Middle Ages. And this would be an endless topic to discuss because obviously it's way more complex than that. And I must say, towards this phase in history, I have kind of at least these attempts in reviving the medieval, pseudo-medieval taste, especially in art, because this is what we will talk about today. It's more sort of not really art history video, but stating, describing a bit all these movements from art and crafts, talking also about characters like Viollet-le-Duc, etc. So that really made so much towards that direction, rediscovering the Middle Ages, Neo-Gothic, in painting, in architecture, and so on. But I still have mixed feeling towards, I would say, any kind of reconstruction that we try to make of medieval times. I do because naturally most of the times this is approximated. And especially in terms of reenactment and stuff like that, there are, certain people who do an outstanding job, not just as reenactors, which is definitely a very complex and demanding thing on its own, very often without any money paid by anyone for doing it, so just out of passion. These are kind of heroic people in many ways. Of course, I never liked the word hero in general, but it's still something that you do fundamentally to spread knowledge of, in this case, of medieval times, but everything actually, every time could be, without, without profiting from it, or whether profiting just because other people say, okay, wow, you did an outstanding job, etc. But there are certain people who also make reenact, and that are also great, let's say, some of these reenactors are also great historians or archaeologists, so they actually know their job, they know what they're doing, and they know actually the limits of any reconstruction. And this is really the point, because from the other side there is always a kind of reaction that in part is positive, because people get to know, in fact, about these historical themes, etc. But at the same time there are other reenactors that are actually, because of this amatorialism by default, let's say, not expert, nor about history, nor about archaeology, nor about anything. They just like to dress up, to do certain things, which is fine, but they also portray, and I see it now literally everywhere. Every time I open Facebook, I have this bunch of pages that I like, or groups, that I go to. I actually use Facebook very few. I'm mostly a watcher. Before I used to participate in debates and stuff. Now I kind of had my my time in this sense, and I just look, and you find it's plenty of videos saying that also in here the visual approach is the one that catches you the most. So that's also what we will discuss now, because in fact these movements, the 19th century movements we will see, are mostly something visual, artistically speaking, either in painting or in architecture and so on. And you realize the amount of mistake and even presumption of people who try to lecture you on how certain things were in the past. Because why? Because they learned this from their reenactment. This is also another huge topic that I don't know why I started now. It's just like an introduction to explain that not everything we see reconstructed is true, which is, I think, to be given for granted normally, but not always, unfortunately. But so it would require a huge discussion on its own about the value of reenactment, its it's the things that we can know from reenactment only, that also historians tend to say, okay, well, no, since it's a reenactment, it's all wrong. It's all, they don't know what they're talking about. Sometimes it's not really so. Experimental archaeology actually, naturally led by proper professionals in the field, has given us astonishing results. Think about, I don't know, Junkelmann, this guy who basically trained up a wall. I don't remember really whether it was a wall maniple or cohort. He crossed the Alps basically with the technology of the Iron Age, and see what a Roman legionnaire would actually function like. He wrote this beautiful book, De Legionen des Augustus. This is perhaps the best book ever existing on medieval, on Roman imperial, early imperial army, the army of the Principate. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. But there is a story, especially throughout social networks and stuff like that, a lot of what I call fanboyism, fundamentally, of people who look at the reenactors without even know what their qualifications are, like what their titles are. I mean, not really titles, but titles here meant really broadly. I'm the first one who says, as a historian, that the sheet of paper on which it's written that I am an historian personally is something very relative in importance, and all that matters is how hard you learn and things you do for history, etc. But it's plenty of chiefly guys. There is some girls, but strangely enough, this is, I mean, not maybe so strangely, but generally these are old males. So they have to show, fundamentally, especially these young male in their early 20s, that I just passed, so I can't say, okay, I'm not I'm not like them anymore. But I'm kidding, of course. Also because most of my audience is in his early 20s, so it's kind of... But they have to explain. They have to go out there and say, oh, look, the Roman legionnaire here fought in this fashion. The medieval tournaments happen in that way. We don't know it because there are no sources telling us, but, I tried it really because it's in the reenactment and it's like in real life. Well, sadly speaking, no, it's not like that. It's not like that for many reasons. You can definitely learn a lot from how combat works from a reenactment experience, but not pretending to know things that objectively could have been different, about which we don't really know anything historically in source. So that even in here, the importance of theory of a hypothesis in front of actual evidence is still important, because there can be many hypotheses, some of which are obviously better than others, and they kind of work ideally, but war is another thing. These reenactors are not fighting for their lives. They're not fighting in formation. Sometimes I found these absurd videos of guys who tried to, shoot 4 arrows in 2 seconds, and pretending that it was the ancient mastery of archery, that is hidden, that today is lost because it was such a trend. No, because an archer who shoots arrows in that way is perfectly useless in a battle and in a formation. And archers didn't work like that. Or I don't know what was that I also saw. Oh yeah, a bunch of guys that were there were 8 guys in a row. In two lines fundamentally. There were, I think, it was a Viking reenactment. They were showing. I don't know what they were doing it. Actually claiming that, but everybody took it at least, and that's the real danger. What the audience actually interprets this like. Basically, this made a 180 degrees turn backwards, fundamentally. So they changed front. Okay, so they switched front. The guys who were from one line in the front, then they turned, and the guys that were in back, they turned like that. Well, everybody's saying, oh, this is how formations are swapped fundamentally. How they are turned and they can change front so easily in a battle, and therefore they're ready to fight like that. No. Formations do not work like that. There is all an order. Formations are not an homogeneous mass of people. They are ordered in a very gradual, stratified fashion. We know this since Xenophon. It remained all the time in that way. If you make a formation changing front that quickly without making it wheel fundamentally, so maintaining the guys who are put in the front, it doesn't work, because it changes everything. Every soldier is kind of looking at the guy who has in the front, is used to certain movements, to rely on certain formation. The best guys are in the front. So if you change formation like that, first of all, it didn't happen historically. Secondly, in fact, it didn't happen because it was useless, because it would have simply disrupted the cohesion of the formation, would have created a mess, actually made it even more vulnerable by certain standards. And that's the reason why, in fact, why armies were surrounded or even flanked. Normally, they were done for. But aside from this, without changing front, it's really the problem of reconstructions are the reaction of the people who watch. So from one side you have this positive element that is represented by the fact that more people know about history, but the quality still of this knowledge is so miserable that I would think that albeit I don't know, maybe I'm pessimist, but I believe that without further, individual commitment, there can't be any real progress towards that direction. I don't know, here in Europe, but I guess also in North America or whatever, it's full of things like, medieval reenactment, the medieval festival. It's essentially a bunch of guys in these towns who have kind of medieval still, that organize this kind of festivals just for eating, just normally, and they dress up in medieval fashion, and that's the medieval fair, fundamentally. Well, it's ridiculous, because most of the times these initiatives are just, looking something that kind of looks medieval. It has nothing to do with the Middle Ages, with all these things in plastic poorly represented, cheaply, and just for selling food, ultimately. It can be fun, it can be nice, I have nothing against it in the first place, but sometimes it's painful to see how, there's a concerted effort to make something that kind of looks in a certain way, and these people don't even know what. In fact, the Middle Ages were, so why do you make a medieval fair at that point? Like, but just make a normal fair that says, okay, look at this food, maybe it was produced in here, or even in the Middle Ages we became famous. Just say that. There's no need to dress up like a clown and pretending that you're not reenacting, but doing essentially an homage to the Middle Ages, because at that point the Middle Ages would say simply, oh, yeah, thanks, we didn't really look like that, just leave us alone. But this is just my opinion, it's not a big deal. But I would say that most, in fact, of the misconceptions that are I want to be optimistic, however, under certain points of view as well, because I believe that over time, even thanks to these initiatives, however, more people got interested in medieval history. The only problem is that the wide majority of these people still fundamentally dwells into these stereotypes that they still don't get rid of. I mean, the alarming thing is that I've been talking randomly also with, as a medievalist, it happened that, I don't know, when I was, trying to I don't know, hit up with on a girl that we were talking about the fact about the Middle Ages, something like that, and maybe you found this person that said, okay, yeah, I love the Middle Ages, and you say, well, why? And the answers could be really brutal, like, really wild, like things like, oh wow, just thinking that those were our ancestors, yeah, right, like, smashing axes, not ashes, maybe priests. No, well, it doesn't make sense. Bad joke, sorry. Smashing axes. Everything was so violent. Everybody it was so dark. It was so tough. And obviously at that point I didn't even comment, because I would have just sounded like a jerk. But it was disappointing, and chances are I maybe didn't talk to that girl. Maybe she also didn't look quite alright. Maybe she gave me an answer that, okay, well, I'm done for here. Well, they're just bad jokes. But the point is, you find this kind of incidentally, even from girls, I think this kind of machism of the Middle Ages, a Middle Ages that is inherently stereotypical, also indeed this, even in the sexual roles, but this is another topic that has, as if in the medieval times, every guy was either a knight or a peasant. It's not maybe that far from truth in general, but the complexity and the multidimensionality, I would say, of the medieval times is astonishing. And it was not just about war, which is kind of ironic because this is a channel dedicated chiefly to medieval military history, but it was about so many things that in fact determined that picture we have. And it wasn't a tougher world than the ancient world. They were pretty much the same. Even much of modern age wasn't that easy at all. Also, what does it mean exactly when we say tough? I discovered, in fact, many of these people I talked to, they mostly thought, they thought kind of the major events that happened in medieval times were the Vikings, for instance. Why? Because maybe they had watched Vikings, or I don't know, when they were little. This also changed wildly according to the country the person was from. There are people in certain countries that completely ignore that has been, some things in others that were kind of massively important for civilization, civil improvement, law, economy. They just think that Middle Ages were kind of a weird place where there were, martyrs wandering around and peasants just, being massacred and everybody was oppressed. And that's really just the gloomy picture. And they were essentially saying that it was cool because it was like that, and thinking that our ancestors were like in that. Well, I don't think it's that nice. I wouldn't think that that's so cool indeed if I didn't know what in fact the whole thing really was about in its complexity, in its because also in there is this emotional response to violence, for which you don't think about the reasons that caused violence, why violence was used, but just you're just excited about this massive idea of violence was so rough, because incidentally the next thought is that this society was, as a consequence, probably so primitive in many ways. Instead, this is something I say all the time, that if you look at how incidentally violence was used in medieval times, you realize that there is a logic behind it that is extremely rational. It's extremely thoughtful. There is not the idea, the stereotype of the Viking was just a crazy, furious person that is thirsty for blood and loot. There is a whole system like that, like an international trade that stretched from from Iceland to Transoxiana, where the Vikings were involved in, just for example, and that their raids and their economy was based, in fact, and also partly on this, on the dynamics of this system, for instance. But nobody cares. Everybody just likes to think, these kind of weird guys emerged from the darkness of Scandinavia and just went pillaging and slaughtering, and maybe adding even some religious factor to the equation because it makes it more controversial, more debatable today. But it wasn't evidently something like that. At least, if for anyone was read something about Vikings, which I'm no expert about Vikings, never had a particular interest in them. Albeit I like them, as I always say, but knows generally. So before we start, because this was just an introduction, I drink a little as usual. I try to make it simple, by the way, today, because also it's a topic I don't know excessively much. So I can say that during the 19th century, there were massive changes into, very rapid also and deep changes in the socio-economical structures of the West. So in many ways, it was the century of true and widespread industrialization. Of course, the Industrial Revolution happened conventionally like one century before, but it was in fact at its early stages and also confined, I would say, to only certain areas of Europe. During the 19th century, industrialization kind of intensifies it. There are massive scientific, technological innovations, discoveries that have a structural impact, for which it's only from the 19th century. In fact, you start talking about things like mass society, for instance. So, in many ways, you can say that the moment of more brutal acceleration and transformation of society from the medieval times up to that point was, in fact, up to I wouldn't say up to today, because it's complicated to say such a thing, but up to that time at least had surely been the 19th century. It would be interesting because, in fact, I think that the growth rates of the 19th century were unmatched in the 20th. Albeit, I'm not really sure. I mean, the fact of being mass society is something you have already accomplished by the beginning of the 20th century. Then, of course, the 20th century expanded way more massively from a sheer quantitative point of view, but in proportion, and I might be wrong in here, but it's just a perception, just to make you understand here, not the relative point. That is fundamentally that it's as if before the 18th century, society was still living in a kind of a medieval-like manner, if we really want to stereotype medieval times in a certain sense. This is evident at so many levels, also from a political and social point of view. The Middle Ages kind of entering crisis, well, also with the idea of the nation state that develops at least in the 19th century. People start living in different fashions. You have, electricity in the houses. You have also the cities that basically have this enormous growth that, in fact, had been relatively minimal in comparison in the previous centuries, even during the modern age, after the Middle Ages. So, in a way, the contrast, this is what at least you can interpret the 19th century like, between what was before and what was after, was kind of highlighting, it was kind of triggering, I would say, instead, a sort of melancholia towards medieval times. So times that were being lost in many ways. Lost because society was transitioning towards something that now seemed to be overwhelmingly different, and that in fact it really was. So in fact, this is the truth, that in many areas of Europe you can argue that the Middle Ages lasted even up to the 20th century. But the general idea is that it's mostly during the 19th century that, at least in the West, in Western Europe, narrowly meant this world of medieval times kind of gets abandoned. And incidentally, in a Europe where, in fact, medieval civilization had kind of given its greatest results. I mean, industrialization kicks in prepotently in places like, obviously, Britain, also in France. There are certain areas, naturally, of Germany and Italy, and other countries all over Europe, but chiefly in this kind of Western portion where, in fact, medieval times had been kind of the most, had produced really a great society, great civilization. There is a parallelism that you can draw, for instance, in the areas where feudalism spread the most, back in the High Middle Ages, like there were essentially northern France and southern England, fundamentally, where these were in fact the areas that had a greater perception of a greater opinion, I would say, of their medieval past, even in terms of national monarchies. So as something unitary that, in a certain sense, could be overlapped in the perception of a country that basically evolved from those times, not that had yet to be formed in many ways. So in those countries, the contrast was the greater, because society was changing the faster, because it had the highest levels of industrialization. There was a more evident Middle Ages out there. Just I think about the great cathedrals you can find in Gothic cathedrals you can find in northern France, in France in general, or in England, So those were kind of parts of the landscape, of the urban landscape, that now was incidentally the same center, or at least the place where the greatest effects of the society changes brought by industrialization were being felt. So it was also a world where you could see, even visually, this sharper contrast between that ancient period and the modernity, let's say. I think Paris is kind of a most obvious example. You had the Tour Eiffel there, that is not as many remains there. From the other side, you had Notre Dame. So the evidence of a city that was summing up, in a certain sense, the legacy of these two periods was all the more evident. There are naturally other considerations you could make in this sense, but and also for the political history of these countries, because naturally the way here was, like, in fact, the previous centuries, there had been things like the French Revolution. So a moment in which, at least in France, the medieval past had been kind of renegated and even erased, physically speaking. During the French Revolution, we had some of the greatest human tragedies in terms of loss of cultural, historical legacy ever, because the revolutionaries dismantled some of the greatest monuments of the French Middle Ages. They destroyed so much also of the nobility, charters, diplomas, stuff like that. We had castles. We had a massive loss in that sense. Also, for England, naturally, the Middle Ages awoke kind of strange dreams, because that was the moment in which it was before the Reformation. So England was technically still kind of Papist as a Catholic country, but at the same time, modernity there had been a greater continuity with the monarchy, something that in France had become kind of more difficult to do. Doesn't matter whether in fact, the English for centuries even denied the fact that they, for centuries, for say after the French Revolution, kind of denied at a certain point, historiographically speaking, that they had back in the 17th century their own revolution, because they wanted to stress instead the continuity, in this sense, into English civilization. This happens actually in not civilization, which is a kind of a resounding term, but the continuity of the English monarchy, of the English institutional system, the English, in fact, of the common law that had been at the base, fundamentally, of the great struggle between the crown and the rest of the social states in England, the Kingdom of England. So in that sense, the medieval times were a moment where, in spite of all, still the English monarchy had been formed. It had been also a moment of relative glory, especially during the 14th, beginning of 15th century, with the English victories over the French monarchy, all this stuff. So also here you understand kind of mixed feelings. There were countries like Germany and Italy that now were not unified yet, or at least were unified in the 19th century, and in these two countries, medieval times were seen definitely, albeit in different fashion, kind of in a similar way as a moment of which the national identities had kind of come out and had emerged and had given much to medieval civilization, and that they had to be inspired by. This is naturally the century of Romanticism, the moment in which in this sense, the national roots were rediscovered, or allegedly discovered, and projected into the Middle Ages, because of certain dynamics now we can't explain, but more or less the fact that after the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, there had been, and post-Carolingian times, there had been the very approximate enucleation of what would have become, in fact, the modern countries today, like from the partition of the Carolingian Empire as three massive countries in Europe. than than had been the Anglo-Saxon kingdom also in there. So there were history that the Iberians had the Reconquista as a gluing factor back in the day of the definition of their Iberian and Catholic mostly identity. So all moments that more or less every country in Europe could claim back as, that was the moment. And this was done because definitely of the national movements of the against the foreign dominations of the Vienne Treaty that had imposed certain peoples to be fundamentally still under control of certain monarchies that were sometimes foreign. So there was the problem of the constitution of the people as such that is kind of problematic naturally, because the concept of nation as it was formulated into the 19th century didn't exist in medieval times. Now in the 19th century the idea is that you are born into that country, you speak that language, so fundamentally you're equal, you're alike to every other guy who does the same in that geographic area, and you are a unique thing. Medieval times were absolutely, and where there is a central state that is equal for, and that makes you equal fundamentally in front of it everywhere you are. Medieval times were completely different. Medieval times were definitely multicultural in many ways, even multi-religious, because religion also during the 19th century was a kind of a discriminating factor into this, into the rise of nations, let's say, and there was definitely nothing like a 19th century state. It was the local communities that had their own juridical customs that just one dynasty was called to protect, to defend, so that there was even a kind of a contractual individual relation between you and your monarch, and this is something incidentally also survived in certain areas of Europe, because the nation state didn't spread quite in the same places in the same way. Definitely, for instance, were countries like Italy and Spain that had a kind of more of a French Jacobin model of state, just like France. Germany, for instance, was very different. It still relied on this kind of local juridical particularism. So even very different, great differences that also kind of mixed up the and make difficult to make further comparison. But nevertheless, in this were the reasons that basically brought medieval times to be retaken back from memory, from the past, and rethought. And there were two currents. I mean, it wasn't really that simple. I mean, it was not such a positive approach to the Middle Ages as we think, as normally this was also the century of positivism, of progressism, if you want. Also these evolutionary theories that were applied into society dramatically, saying that basically there were different stages of civilizations for which some were inferior to others. Also certain cultures, certain civilizations were inferior to others. There was still this kind of even atheistic perspective that existed out there, for which now especially in the layhood, but also this is the century in which communism emerges. So the idea of also a fight against the church, the ecclesiastical structures, and therefore the Middle Ages were seen from that perspective by any standard as a kind of a dark and oppressive and terrible time where the church oppressed everybody, and scientifical progress, and now in the 19th century we have, because we're so cool and smart and clever, was so prevented by the obscurantism of the church that they didn't allow, as if scientific progress was awaiting for the church to say something about it. And the by the way, it was the same church in medieval times that actually triggered great part of scientific studies and etc. But this is not just the point. The point is that there was a general, secularization of thought that saw, in fact, medieval times as just a sort of dark hole where nothing interesting had happened. And the most disturbing thing is many people today still actually reason in that way. So they're not reasoning as people in the 21st century. They're actually reasoning as people in the 19th century, like 200 years old. This is incidentally where all, in opposition to medieval times, all the magnification, let's say, of the Roman Empire actually came in. Think about Gibbon, etc. Well, so many people still think. I mean, there were kind of great works like the one, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire was decline. I don't remember, of Gibbon, were kind of great works for the time, because objectively, the 19th century is this moment also of great development of historiography, where there is a more serious reconsideration. But still, people actually, the average person, this is impressive, today owns those 19th century beliefs towards the past than something more modern that has developed now in the last century in a substantial way, in a kind of very widespread way all over the academies. I mean, it's not something that is hidden or concealed to the wide public. You can't go in any library, buying a book and reading and saying that it wasn't like that. But still, the majority of the prejudice towards medieval times actually stems from there. And this is from one side. From the other side, instead, you have and also if you want, as a critique to these attitudes, to these beliefs, a revival of the Middle Ages. A revival that, in this sense, tries to get as scientifical as the fundamentally the critique that was trying to say that now progress had wiped out those areas of stagnation, of regression, even of oppression and stuff. But by saying, this is not true, this is not really true, and let's see what the true Middle Ages actually were, and let's try to do it. Now, unfortunately, this is also what it was definitely a positive thing in this sense, from this perspective. But at the same time, as we were saying before, even the positive prejudices that we have towards medieval times actually stem from the considerations that emerged at that time from this other side, and that naturally are not so accurate, because now, at more than 150 years of distance, we actually have somewhat improved, in fact, in historiography, and we treat medieval times in a much more accurate way than it was done even by these medieval lovers, fundamentally, of the 19th century. Excuse me, I drink a little. And also in here, pop culture is kind of overloaded with either this negative or prejudice, or negative or positive prejudices towards medieval times. So the Middle Ages were, at this point, from one side or the other, perceived fundamentally now as another place, an imaginary other place at this point that had definitely occurred historically, but that represented much more than just its historical reality. It was loaded with certain ideals and lost values. I mean that or at least that lost ideals and values that were actually also believed to be so. That means lost. Actually, we still live with an enormously powerful medieval legacy, and we actually don't even know. We haven't still rationalized it at fullest, and not just because of these prejudices that, however, inaccurate, still, however, reveal, even from a kind of a Freudian point of view, how important medieval times still are for us. I mean, this is also very important if you think about it. That we kind of say everything and its opposite about medieval times still today, even actually by not knowing them, by not knowing how much of medieval times actually survived in our everyday life, and therefore this is a sort of a subconscious way of of actually admitting that we perceive the greatness of the Middle Ages, or the greatness of their impact on our civilization. Because, hey, most of what we see, also just going out in the streets. I mean, if you in Europe, you can't do without medieval times. You can't say, I go into a town, and I don't think this was a place actually that developed in the Middle Ages in some way, or at least that had to do in part with whatever medieval civilization has produced. We come from there. It's been 1,000 years of history. We passed through that. It's a moment in which so much of our, in fact, it is true, our identities, our histories have been have been developed, and you can't escape that. Middle Ages didn't happen, just somewhere mysteriously, and in other places not. We all went through it. We all do. And this is very international, if you want, because leaving aside from the countries that the European eventually colonized, starting from the late Middle Ages, in fact, and eventually also those civilizations that had their own Middle Ages, that naturally is very complicated to define, because the idea of Middle Ages actually exists only in the West, in the way at least we know it. Then, of course, even I suspect in today's pop culture had a massive influence also on other countries in general. Just think about the influence of countries like the United States, the UK, also in the rest of the world, and therefore more or less I believe that aside from certain specific countries that kind of maintain a very strong local perspectivism, like China, for instance. But the idea of Middle Ages is very powerfully present in the historical memory, let's say, at least knowing that there has been something like that, and that corresponds to variously to a defining moment in our respective civilizations. So this is kind of there. But this is the point, that the Middle Ages in the 19th century were loaded with these ideals and values, as if, in fact, they were something separated from the actual historicism. I mean, especially if you look at art and painting, you realize that evidently the various authors didn't actually intend to portray what the medieval times as they really thought they had been really, but rather to stress certain meanings, certain ideals and values of the ones we have mentioned, that now naturally were romanticized, were kind of adapted and developed in ways that also were pretty much in fact intertwined with what at that moment in history was also the common feeling, the common ideas, etc. And therefore knowing that also in that context, in those works, that the Middle Ages were something different, but the resilience of these reinterpretation of the Middle Ages has been definitely very, very strong, especially for those people who actually didn't know much about medieval times in the first place, and looked at that and just imagined fundamentally that was the case. So this is actually, I'm simplifying brutally, because quite simply the topic is immensely vast, and the especially the medieval reconstructions that have been carried out in different countries have all their different meaning in many ways. Also, this fashion of looking back at the medieval times, etc., is not over yet. I mean, the 20th century has been full of it. The 21st century seems to have even a sort of further revival of this. So it's particularly interesting, in my opinion, because we are, I believe, kind of bring back medieval times in our in our mindset, in our world. I don't know how evident this is really. I naturally talk from the perspective of someone who is kind of almost at all times with his head in medieval times, at least in terms of research and of general things I surround myself with. But I do believe that very slowly the prejudices towards medieval times are kind of declining. There is, however, a very urgent need to actually redefine how the narrative overall, because even in here, with as I was saying, with the age of social network, you realize that there are people who share thoughts and memes and other stuff, like saying, "Oh, it's not true that the medieval times were an age of darkness, etc." All kind of repeating a bit like parrots the same thing, but actually not substantiating their knowledge of medieval times. And what is very complicated in medieval times, in my opinion, that is present even in the academy, is that we lack increasingly a general reinterpretation of these times. I mean, even in the academy, medieval studies are so fragmented. Usually they're kind of minority compared to others. I mean, I believe obviously there are more people studying contemporary history than medieval history. I think it's self-evident. Also because there is much more room for original, neo-regional topics to be brought forward. Naturally, they're also very political in many ways. But even in say, in terms of what is actually studied in medieval history, you realize that, and you can't blame actually scholars for this, because medieval times are 1 millennium of history of a whole continent, if not more, and therefore every scholar kind of picks her tiny part of it and starts focusing exclusively on that. This is a problem that has actually nothing to do, strictly speaking, with the Middle Ages, but it is a great problem of academy, of the scientific communities now that are brutally orienting towards hyper-specialization. We lack generalists, we lack people who are capable of an omnicomprehensive reading, and this is also a very serious problem. So the consequence is you have a public, an audience that is incredibly, a popular culture is incredibly interested about the Middle Ages and asking for it and trying to know about it. And from the other side, an academic world that is increasingly distancing itself, or distanciating, I don't know what I'm talking about right now, from these masses. So that it's very difficult to communicate. Even when you look at those documentaries that they try to do for, making people learn a bit more, they're kind of cheap, they're kind of bad, they're still pretty bad in terms of, they mostly focus also in here on the visual approach, not the making people brains actually working and trying to make a qualitative progress. It's just saying, okay, let's look something that in fact looks medieval, and then for the rest I don't really care to understand. And this is what I think sadly characterizes the majority of the interest existing towards medieval times today, which is very disappointing, naturally, because you don't see a progress. You just see an expansion of the interest, which is fine, but you don't see a great deal of improvement when it comes to the actual perception of medieval times in terms of prejudices and so on. And this is really bad, because eventually, the prejudice is kind of wrong, kind of at all times. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, because it's really simply having an idea that you do not ground with evidence, and that's really kind of bad. Or maybe you do ground with evidence, but you don't actually, that evidence is wrong because you don't know the thing directly. This is what happens with all times in history. with all history, this is a problem that happens actually for all times. But now, sticking to medieval ones, this is probably even the wildest, I believe, in some ways. And definitely medieval times are the ones that still have kind of the worst stigma in many ways. For some political reasons now, also the 20th century is being reread and actually misread, in my opinion, to highlight, but this is really political, and I think it's rubbish in many ways, because politics should never enter in history. This is also another, in my perspective, disgusting, nauseating thing. I mean, this idea that in order to be a historian, you have to be someone who has a political color. Because we had, indeed, during the 20th century, many scholars, some of the most prominent ones, that were very politically oriented towards one party, one color, one ideology. And this is very wrong, because there might have been even good historians, but fundamentally they have left this legacy of politicism into history. I, for instance, study history because I understand the political importance that it can have to learn about history. I was discussing that today exactly with making that video, chapter, that paragraph on the Formkriege. But myself, if I had to tell you which political color I am, what ideology I actually, I have my tendencies, but they are more like because of my family extraction or something like that, but they do not actually influence much the way I see history. I try to narrate history. Indeed, I'm kind of a liberal capitalist. I mean, I'm not liberal in the American sense of the word. That in Europe liberal means something, in the United States means another thing. I'm liberal in the sense of liberalism, in the idea of the true, what would be also in the United States the true original liberal. Theoretically all American citizens are kind of liberal by definition, because founding fathers were, in this sense, they were asking for liberty. That's the original sense, and that's why I look to, I'm a capitalist, definitely. I'm partly tendentially, in fact, a liberist in the sense I don't like things like communitarism, in every sense, both in from a more communistic point of view, nor from an identitary point of view. So I try to be an individual rather than part of it. But also in here, naturally, there are several intersections. But that's why when I read history, I try to say, okay, I have to stay open to every option in here, because you don't have to search for a pattern of interpretation, but you definitely need a narrative in some way at the end of the day, because you can study history and at a certain point you have to tell it in a certain way. If anything, you have to tell it, because that's what I do on Schwerpunkt. I must give a sense to what I learn, and in order to deliver the same information, I can't make it a list of data, because that's not, that's what the historian has in front of his eyes before, but at the end of the day he has to extrapolate something from it. So it's very complicated, and that's why, that's how distortions actually happen at the end of the day, because guess what? History is not true, but it's evident that history is not true. History is never true. Certain things, we don't actually study history on the basis of reality. We study history on the basis of what we get from reality, which is a very different thing, and it's very partial, it's very narrow, it's very dubious also sometimes. So what we reconstruct it's a sort of a intellectual exercise. It's like, we have this evidence, we have to take it for good sometimes. This is very evident when, in those times in history when you have a very few sources, a very few evidence, you say, okay, this is all we got. And what do we do? Do we believe it? Don't we believe it? But the tendency is, okay, we have this, it's the only thing we have, let's kind of, accept that this is still part of the truth. But what do you think is true of, the average history book? School history book. I think it's very, it's very good if you arrive to to a 70 and 80% of, not truth, but of what actually happened, because this is what really history is, an approximation, and we have to deal with it. But it's exactly the approximation that leaves us room for criticism, which is, at the end of the day, the only thing we need. We don't study history just for learning what happened in the past, because legitimately, even if I love what happened in the past, it's not that I'm really driven by the curiosity of knowing it, because I will never know anything about it. I will never live in there. It's not of no use for living in those times. I actually study the past because it's something that it can be useful for me as an individual. And this is also kind of sad, because we will never know how it was really like. And this is something that makes me want to cry most of the times, because if I really stop to think even, how much we have lost from the past, it's like, it's awful. Sometimes I even think, maybe people pass, okay, but there's certain things that should remain, that should inspire other people to live better. Think about when an archive burns, how much we have lost throughout all the distractions, all the things that happen. I mean, it's heartbreaking. I can't find another better definition. It's really that. So I would say that this 19th century revival was in part dictated by the same feelings. I mean the idea that there was an evenly standing medieval age in front of, in legacy, all around you in countries, European ones, but you have cathedrals, churches, stuff like that. You say, what was this? Let's attribute to it a sort of importance that we have to reinvent for, stressing its really importance. And I would say that in spite of all the misinterpretations, the 19th century gave us some of the most fascinating, some of the greatest masterpieces. Let's leave aside art, but for instance, I love Wagner. I love the Lohengrin. I love and what you the Tannhäuser. There is so much from that world that has produced beautiful things. We're inspired to the Middle Ages. So it wasn't that bad, and it's very fascinating, because if you watch the Lohengrin and you don't actually consider it, in fact, in its historical setting, or the Tannhäuser, you don't consider it in historical setting, or many other of the Brennan's Brennan, and you're kind of losing great part of it. There were also many historical tragedies, historical dramas, like thinking about König Ottokar's Glück und Ende by Gabriel Parsa. I mean, there were some very interesting historical settings. This didn't just date back to medieval times, but just think about Manzoni, for instance, who wrote so much about also the modern age, but also medieval one, with the Longobards and things. And that was cool, objectively. And the 19th century produced a huge amount of beautiful art, literature, etc., that was inspired by medieval times and gave us a beautiful portrait of those times, albeit naturally filtered towards through the context of many, and I think many legions, many stereotypes, many narratives, in fact, that still live in part today. So there was also a sense of insecurity in the 19th century towards these great changes in society. So this insecurity, as always, brings to the search for security, definitely. So of truths, of more precise knowledge, and of facts, substantially. So this triggered, in part, the research. Usually, actually started from, I believe, really the architectonical and decorative environment, really, and of at least certain expressive styles that, being reconnected to the past in some way, could repropose to safeguard their legacy. So a great fortune in particular had all those various forms of adhesion to this alleged spirit. This is the Geist of medieval age, of the medieval era, that at this point had acquired fundamentally the characters of a myth. It had become mythological, definitely, in its forms. So you had artistical craftsmanship, for instance, that also was definitely declining, and that therefore wanted to preserve itself in some way. This was declining naturally because of the serial productions that now, coming from the industrialization system, were definitely very harshly competing with the ancient handmade products and so on. So there is these movements that are born that actually stem very interestingly from this kind of very structural causes. We're talking about the arts and crafts movement, for instance. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. So talking about the arts and crafts movement, this was chiefly an artistical movement, the aim of which was the re-evaluation of craftsmanship against the overwhelming industrial production, and the decline also in taste that was produced by it, chiefly in the second half of the 19th century. And this stemmed, in fact, from, in part, very practical reasons. So, as we've seen, a market problem fundamentally, where now the progress of industrialization made the costs of certain goods dropping dramatically, becoming extremely cheap, so that everybody could buy them. And this was naturally seen. It was some kind of also of an elitistic thought. I mean, it was not all kind of positive. In the case of arts and crafts, also there were some, we'll say it with William Morris, that also was involved partly in kind of a political thinking that was siding from the side, in fact, of workers, of the industries and so on. But it was fundamentally also an antiquarian taste. It was the idea that the rich guy could have its own, medieval style-made objects that could, were actually very, very valuable in that sense, were also very, definitely not cheap, and that could correspond to a sort of social status symbol, fundamentally, to say, okay, the middle classes may have become rich enough to have things that up to a few generations ago only noblemen, only aristocrats could have, but we still, aristocrats, have more taste, have more education, can appreciate better better products, fundamentally, that also have a qualitative taste that is not just, in fact, just a matter of material value, but it's really the concept, the idea that lays behind it, that reveals a sort of more refined taste that the other commoners, let's say, do not have. So never also underestimate the kind of double face of this this movement, for which, from one side it was actually socially involved to better the conditions of certain workers, etc., but from the other side it was still kind of elitistic, were not aristocratic in taste. Definitely the arts and crafts movement was connected to the Neo-Gothic taste. It was reborn, revived into Europe, created actually as a Neo-Gothic proper to Europe, and also to the Pre-Raphaelite artistical current that, and in the arts and craft that we will see now, also most of the paintings we see here comes from the Pre-Raphaelites, and definitely the leader of this movement was definitely Morris. Morris was William Morris was, and now we'll see him in a little more detail, and his immediate followers, particularly Crane and Ashby, were the most prominent figures of the arts and crafts, and who had a remarkable importance in all fields of applied art, fundamentally, and also on architecture and in the creation, fundamentally, and spread of the Art Nouveau. In fact, the first exposition of the arts and crafts was in 1888. In fact, it created an arts and crafts exhibition society. So it started to become, in a way, also commercial on its own. Definitely wasn't just driven by ideal reasons. So talking about William Morris that we mentioned, he was a poet, artist, and also kind of social agitator. That he was English. He was born in Helmhouse, Walthamstow, 1834, and died in Hammersmith in 1896. He was actually born from a pretty well-off family of businessmen, of traders. I don't really remember, but he was also in this kind of greater commercial activity, and he was initially meant to become a clergyman. He was actually started to the Anglican ecclesiastical career, and in 1853 he entered the Exeter College of Oxford, and where he knew other figures including Burne-Jones, and he got basically in love. He was extremely enthusiastic for the Gothic cathedrals, and this happened chiefly during a journey in France, and therefore at that point he decided he would become an architect, and he began to study with Street. At the same time, he started to himself to publish a review, the Oxford and Cambridge magazine in 1856, which was dedicated actually to social reforms, and he this brought him in contact with Ruskin and Rossetti, and were animated fundamentally by his own interests and his own same feelings towards the contemporary social problems. And Rossetti actually persuaded him to dedicate to painting, and chose him together with Burne-Jones as an aide, a helper for the decoration of the Union Debating Hall of Oxford in 1857. So on the footsteps of Ruskin, Morris became a great, speaking figure for medieval art, a great supporter of the revival of medieval art, and in particular of the Gothic style, extending also his attempt of restoration of medieval spirit, fundamentally in the arts, but also in morals and in social doctrines. So in order to react the decline in taste provoked by the ever-growing industrialization, Morris founded the Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company in 1861. That was eventually directed after Morris' death by the Earl, that born, if I'm not wrong, in 1816, died in 1932. This was essentially a industry of clothes, of other materials, of stained glasses as well, also other things like pottery, I don't know how to call it, or ceramic fundamentally. Excuse me a second, I have to close one thing here. I'm sorry. It's a damn connection here. I should make my videos without internet on. Okay, just give me another second. Here. Good. Sorry for the interruption. And of all these products that he created in his company, fundamentally were actually designed by himself. And he also founded the Count Scott Press. And we can't say it in general. Morris' ideas were fundamental for the movement of arts and crafts, definitely. But the exaltation, I would say, of craftsmanship work was with its very high costs at this point. In fact, we was talking about before, kept a very elitary character. So in its production fundamentally prevented the integration of these arts in the reality of the industrial world, as it would be obvious, also because it was in quite open polemic with it. So however, Morris' work was an essential point of reference for all the further movements of renewal in architecture, in applied arts. There's the Red House that Morris commissioned to Webb in 1859, and that he also cured in its details in decorations. Morris was also a man of letters in some ways. He definitely had this more famous theoretical activity and practice in the field of figurative arts, but he also had this also more properly literary activity. He in fact began to write when he was very young. In 1857 he composed a great part of the volume The Defense of Guinevere and Other Poems in 1858. Then he published poetry, essays, and tales in the Oxford Cambridge magazine, and in 1866 he began to compose a series of narrative poems like The Life and Death of Jason in 1867, The Earthly Paradise 1868, 1870. He also translated many Icelandic sagas, interestingly enough, into English prose, and as well as the Germanic saga and the Scandinavian one. And this inspired him to write in 1876 the story of Sigurd and the Volsung and the Fall of the Nibelungs. So, dreaming of projects of social reform, he also cooperated in the socialist cause. Cooperated with socialist cause with Monet, discourses, articles, verses. He wrote A Chance for Socialists, but he actually spoke against anarchic tendencies after the riots of Trafalgar Square, November 1887, and therefore he retired himself from political activity and came back to literature with, in 1888, A Dream of John Bull. So also here you realize all medieval-inspired themes, and A Tale of the House of Wolfings and All the Kindreds of the Mark in 1889, The Roots of the Mountains in 1890, which is a kind of a utopistic novel. News from Nowhere, 1891, where he actually imagined England, future England, in a sort of communistic regime. So you can understand that there is also, I'm personally not a fan of communism in general, nor socialism, just to tell it all very euphemistically. So that's also why in part I have this kind of mixed feelings towards these figures, because even these were very cultured people. Morris translated even the Aeneid in 1875, the Odyssey in 1887. Yeah, but what for eventually? This kind of that's what we would call today's a sort of radical chic, fundamentally, but so radical also in political thought, and that's what my perplexities stem the most from, because actually medieval times were, also in here you realize that this person made a reinterpreted in a way medieval times in a fashion that was definitely also a political misinterpretation by certain standards. Now, I don't want definitely criticize Morris' knowledge. He was definitely a much more cultured person. I believe that I can be, but in general, why eventually this reaction? This is something I wonder myself today. I mean, there are many people I know, around me that are kind of very politically oriented, even not really towards that direction, because to tell the truth, all of my PhD colleagues, I believe, are not at all. They do not have socialistic tendencies, if not, but I don't think that they don't come from that orientation. But in fact, it's full of people who have this interpretation of history that is kind of very emotionalistic one. I mean, I do believe that firmly that much of lingering toward the left is fundamentally a much more emotionalistic driven thing, which I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, because also emotions are important, also sentiments are important, but I, for instance, believe to have a much more colder and, in the sense, rational idea of the past. Even though I am a kind of emotional person, you realize also when I make videos, I have my own passion, my own sentiments towards medieval history. I'm relatively sensitive towards these topics, but I still don't indulge into it. It's exactly because I have a kind of a reasonable approach to a rational approach to history, etc., that I try not to fundamentally not to fall prey just of cynism I try to, I have my own feelings. I just distance myself from them when I study history, because I don't think it's useful. I don't think that's the mission of the historian in many ways. So that's important for me. What searching for something to whatever. So going on, there we've seen Morris. We've seen fundamentally that he had been searching for this craftsmanship and decorative models drawn allegedly from the Middle Ages. And what is interesting in this sense that besides there is in part a sort of hypocrisy, because most of the works now that Morris was proposing were for actually a conservative and bourgeois public, fundamentally. So this idea of objects and styles were still pretty elitary objects. So we know that medieval times, also in here, what is that they were really imitating? Were they thinking to imitate something that was medieval in nature, or that kind of looked medieval? Because also this market was definitely a market that was the one that was fighting actually the same Maurist ideas. Conservatives against socialists that were developing in these decades as an important force in politics. So there was something that was not working, and all in a world that was essentially Victorian society that was being criticized, in fact, at the time for all of its problems fundamentally, even though it was chanted as a moment of glory, etc. But the British Empire, even at that point, had kind of serious problems. So it's the 19th century of the insecurity in many ways. It also had so many contradictions, had so many different faces, and there was hypocritical in many ways, in my opinion. Looking at painting in here, I don't know what your feelings are towards Pre-Raphaelites. Personally, I have mixed feelings because some of these paintings are actually pretty cool. I like them, but the problem is that they disoriented the audience towards Middle Ages in general, I believe. So sometimes there are two, I believe, Pre-Raphaelite paintings are also kind of much too sensual looking. I mean, I have nothing against sensual things, but it's like it's more about that than the object is being portrayed. That seems just an excuse. By the way, it's funny how Pre-Raphaelites sometimes jumped in differently from the classical age into the Middle Ages. There's also a lot of proto-racism, in my opinion, in the idea of the way societies were developing, because the idea also of representing this ancient classical world was, however, very sensual and very corrupt. It was typical of this kind of Protestant kind of Puritanism that wanted to look at those Mediterranean societies, essentially stressing the fact they were kind of corrupted at the end of the day, beautiful but corrupted. And that was the same idea fundamentally. It was circulating historiographically speaking in works like Gibbon, etc. This idea of Hellenistic equals to morally rotten, some kind of that eventually brings to that generation of Western civilization that remained pure instead back in the origins and stuff like that. So it's kind of disturbing sometimes, but nevertheless, some paintings I think are very beautiful. Some of them, at least. I'm not a great fan of Pre-Raphaelites in general, but definitely some paintings are very, also technically and artistically, of great quality. It's self-evident. So, talking about Pre-Raphaelites, what were they? They're simply also in here because we don't have much time. So, Pre-Raphaelism would be this artistic and also literary movement. This is often, Pre-Raphaelite painting is kind of more famous than Pre-Raphaelite literature, but also in here promoted in England towards the mid-19th century. This movement was promoted by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, founded in 1848 by the painters Rossetti, that we have already met with Morris, his interaction, Holman Hunt, Millet, and the sculptor Wüllner, that basically associated together with other two thinkers, and I don't know just to say that in English. Wait a second. What the hell? Isn't there a substantive here? Well, however, critical thinkers. Let's put it in this way. There were Stevens and actually W.M. Rossetti, because the other Rossetti was DG, and also the painter Collinson. So the Pre-Raphaelite movement can be interpreted at least as a manifestation of the romantic tendency of reevaluating the art of the so-called primitives and the 15th century painters. This is what pre-Raphael is, pre-Raphael fundamentally, and to so pre-Renaissance fundamentally, and to relate to art to this also very markedly religious and openly religious expressivity. There are lots of religious themes into Pre-Raphaelite art. Naturally, this was also connected to the kind of, English religious sensitivity, its complex religious history of England, and so on. So this was also inspired by the German movement of the Nazarenes, that also we'll see as painters, but also to the French primitif, and especially to the early work of Ingres, and also to the current of the so-called Italian purists. So at the beginnings of the Pre-Raphaelite movements, fundamentally between 1848 and 1853, this group had a very strong, I would say, mystical and aesthetical character, especially in Rossetti's work, over which had also very strong influence Brown as another, and the Pre-Raphaelites also very interestingly had a very assumed at a certain point a very open anti-academic attitude, evidently against the rhetoric of the historical, framing of the Middle Ages, and not only, and also for a more with a more poetic interpretation of the themes and a faithful, accurate execution of these works, like for giving back medieval art its true characters. So something that was naturally also looking at historical research into looking at medieval times and reinterpreting them in a better fashion. Remember that the 19th century was also especially in countries like England and the German world, there was an astonishing, but this happened actually all over Europe, in a very consistent way, an astonishing recovery of all the medieval sources. The great things like the Monumenta Germaniae Historica were created now. Basically, literally all the sources from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland for medieval times, and also of the older Roman Empire in part. So also some Italian sources went in there, were basically all systematically reviewed, framed, criticized. It was an enormous, in fact we use the MGH now still today. It's very useful. It is happening in many other countries actually. Great part of this had born in Italy with Muratori back in the beginning of the 18th century, and this now in the 19th century assumed this greater systematization all over Europe. It was amazing in this sense. So actually medieval history was starting to be studied. It doesn't matter how ideologically, because this still happened. Just think about authors like, Gregorovius or such other things, that are so markedly ideological, but still they were consistent because they were based on sources, were based on a more scientific and advanced reading of medieval sources. So even in art, this was trying to be recovered. So it was a very accurate artistical philology, we can say, that wanted to reproduce. We'll see this now, especially with Viollet-le-Duc in France, the actual medieval art for what it had been. In the case of the Pre-Raphaelites, naturally the sensual / emotional side was spiritual feeling was very much out there. These are very emotional paintings, very sensual paintings that want to make the true feelings of the characters, because it's usually all actual people in there. It's rarely landscapes just on their own. There is a great attention given to human figure, to human emotions, and so on, human personality, etc. And this movement was opposed, in fact, for the refusal of authors like Raffaello in the 16th century, the Italian Renaissance in general, because of its kind of modernistic. Also here, it was a wild interpretation of the thing, but like using Raffaello as fundamentally the watershed from medieval times into the Renaissance, and therefore say, okay, we don't care about Renaissance art that in that age was actually being praised, because actually Renaissance art was pretty much used and famous, and it was even together with neoclassicism definitely reacquired by these great powers in Europe that wanted to inspire to the imperial models of Rome, the artistical measures of perfection of Hellenic art and so on. So the Pre-Raphaelites were instead looking specifically at medieval art as the true model of inspiration without other contamination. And however, when Ruskin in 1851 began to, kind of we have a very authoritative figure to intervene, the movement began to actually meet the interests of the public, and eventually it even took some kind of moralistic attitudes in a tone of protest against materialism of industrial civilization, the exploitation of the poor classes, and it transformed itself into a social in a social struggle, into social polemics against the contemporary society, and it actually was qualified as a typically English phenomenon. So also England, in fact, as the leading industrial nation at a time where the effects of industrialization on society were more evident as a whole. So the Pre-Raphaelites Pre-Raphaelite painters especially were persuaded of being capable to give a kind of faithful and non vulgar portrait of contemporary life that brought them to also become sort of interpreters of Victorian society, catching these ambiguities and moral struggles existing within it. And this second phase of the artistical the artistical Pre-Raphaelism was the protagonism of William Morris, and that was also flanked by Burne-Jones and Crane in its polemics that we have seen in favor of craftsmanship, of a concrete production of decorative art, and as we have seen, this would have in fact a great importance for developments of architecture and decorative art in the future. There are many Pre-Raphaelites drawings and xylographies that appeared on several periodics of the time, like Cornhill magazine, Good Words, and there were even things like wallpapers fundamentally, and textiles of Morris, and the tapestries and stained glasses of Burne-Jones that actually gave this movement also greater importance in terms of artistical products and so on. From the other side, we have the Nazarenes that we have mentioned, kind of are worth the mention. These were naturally the term Nazarene came from the epithet of Jesus Christ, and this was a group of German painters of the first half, a bit before, of the 19th century, that proposed to renovate art on religious and patriotic basis fundamentally, and also together with new ideas that were spread by authors that are relatively famous, and other definitely more famous, like Wackenroder, Tieck, Schlegel, Boisseret, Schiller, etc. So the major exponents of the Nazarenes were Overbeck and Foer, that were inspired in their aggregative, in their social model by the old brotherhoods, and they founded in Vienna the Lukasbund in 1809, actually reacting to academic teaching also here. So this idea, here we are in full romanticism, of course, and they took as a model of inspiration the art of Albrecht Dürer, and as well as the Italian so-called Italian primitives, and even of the young Raffaello, telling the truth. So this is also interesting. In 1810, Overbeck and Foer also went living in Rome, where they were reached eventually by Cornelius, Veit, von Schadow, Fürich, etc. These were all Catholics, or at least converted to Catholicism. And the Lukasbrüder promoted the also, let's say they took, they stayed in Rome at the convent of Saint Isidore at the Pincio, where other Protestant exponents of the group that also had kind of aggregated, like Rebnitz, Schnorr, von Karlsfeld, Olivier, stayed at the Caffarelli Palace on the Campidoglio, and therefore would be called Capitolines. So they had this various, these two different areas of Rome where they stayed. So actually the name of Nazarene came to denominate the group only at the end of the 19th century, which it was a kind of ironical nickname. It was given because of their hairstyle, the Nazarene style fundamentally, that was followed by these painters, that naturally alluded at the also Catholic conversion of some of them. But even since 1817, the same von Goethe had used this term to define actually the religious and patriotic painting of the group. So this is particularly interesting, and the Nazarenes predilected together, let's say, besides with certain sacred objects of medieval times that were often read in a symbolical fashion, the portrait. The portrait. Also in here, a great attention to the personas, the individuals, and especially in drawings, the sites of Rome and of the countryside, so that that are usually animated by this either figures of, let's say, familiar or figure or scenes fundamentally. The Nazarenes also aimed at reviving the fresco technique. For instance, in Rome, always in Rome, Cornelius, Overbeck, von Schadow, and Veit executed in the Zuccari Palace for the Bartoli the frescoes with the biblical stories that now are in actually in Berlin in the Gemäldegalerie. They date back to 1815, 1817, while Overbeck, Veit, and Koch, Schnorr, von Karlsfeld, and Cornelius painted the Casino Massimo to the Lateran, the Divine Comedy, the Free Jerusalem, and the that would be the Furious Roland, the crazed Roland, in in the... What the hell is this? The thing doesn't work. Excuse me 1 second. Okay, whatever, this is not important now. And this dates back instead to 1817, 1830. It's also, by the way, the Italian purists movement was inspired by the Nazarenes, and in fact their manifesto in 1843 was signed also by Overbeck. And there is also another branch of this that fundamentally were actually not even a branch, I think it was a thing on its own. The so-called Pietists of the Württemberg, they were also known as, in fact, as the Neukirchliche, so the members of the new church. That's founded by Wirtz, but this is another topic that we maybe for another time. This is now chiefly really the artistical side of the story. So, as we have seen, both the Pre-Raphaelites and the Nazarenes were trying to bring back the pictorial forms that could be reconnected in some way to the art of medieval period. This was done in contrast with the very importantly also against the innovative tendencies of the artistical vanguards that in the 19th century were taking place. So very different models from the ones that were they were now trying to revive, to recover. And always in the 19th century there's other very important phase that this is a very important side of this medieval revival that, as we have mentioned before, hinted at it before, took place in architecture. In here, the historical styles of both actually the Gothic and the Renaissance were used as symbols to proclaim either certain, I would say, political or ideological faiths in some way. From Pagan onwards, Gothic science in particular was firmly identified with the Middle Ages, seen as an age of faith. This is also where very often our kind of prejudice towards medieval times, thinking that everything was literally dominated by the church, really comes from. This is not really true. I mean, I have a pretty hefty playlist on medieval Christianity that kind of deals with this, and not that I don't think that obviously religion was not important, it was central medieval times. You can't understand actually medieval times nor ancient times if you don't understand their religion, because it doesn't make sense if you don't really it doesn't mean anything the way it is if you realize it. And the especially Pugin, I don't know if I translate him correctly, but he wrote especially the contracts, this work that is a very long title, Contrasts or a Parallel Between the Noble Edifices of the 14th and 15th Centuries and Similar Buildings of the Present Day, of 1836. That is fundamentally the work that really made the difference towards that direction. And talking about him, Pugin, I think it might be, if he was actually an Englishman. He was fundamentally an architect, but also a writer, a drawer. He was born in London in 1812 and died there in 1852. He was son of another relatively famous painter, French painter, Augustus Charles Pugin at this point, since it was French, and Pugin in English, that had emigrated in England after in 1792, which is not a really random date, telling the truth, for French to emigrate, and that had been famous for other certain publications on architectures and topography. For instance, specimens of Gothic architecture from 1821 to 1823, illustration of the public building of London, 1825, 1828, and Pugin was Pugin's son. I mean, Pugin, his name was August Welby Nordmore Pugin, actually. And he is considered, in this sense, the greater exponent of the movement of re-evaluation of Gothic architecture, at least in England. So when he was extremely young, still, I mean extremely, not so extremely, but he, very young, he actually provided the designs for the furniture of Windsor Castle, interestingly enough. And between 1836 and 1843, he actually studied the fundamentally, I don't know how to say this, the furniture, the decor, in style of the seat of the English Parliament. So definitely very prestigious tasks, commissions, and he built also, more or less at his own expense, so these weren't definitely poor people, several churches that today we don't actually remember for an immense artistical value, but nevertheless this gives you the idea of the person, and several, also some actually private houses. And Pugin's most important work is, however, in the field of writing and in pamphlets, I would say, in defense of Gothic style, and also the religious character of art. This is particularly important, given that in medieval times this was religion and art were all one. And in the name of this ideal, he eventually converted to Catholicism, interestingly enough, in 1834. So you see here that there was this kind of criticism towards the current English society, also at the point of converting to Catholicism, to stress fundamentally the importance of the origins, where England was still part of the Roman Church, as you know, not after the Anglican schism, so before the Anglican schism of the 16th century. So several of his manuscripts and his drawings are also preserved in the British Museum, in the Royal Institute of British Architects, in the local library, and there are these other works that we have mentioned, the contrasts, essentially, or a parallel between the noble and so on, where we said before, very long name, I won't repeat it, but also in 1841, the true principles of Christian architecture in England, and in 1843, an apology for the revival of Christian architecture. So here you realize that it was the religious element in this of religion in the revival of architecture. And so this is important because in England, by the way, several churches and colleges was conventionally built in now in Neo-Gothic style, because they were opposed to the more progressive and lay institutions that preferred generally the Renaissance style. So even within the that English colleges had very ancient roots. There are also enormous, very especially some of them, especially the Oxford and Cambridge, had an enormous amount of still own a huge amount of private land. So also here several interests that were political, social, even economical, rather than just merely matters of artistical state or aesthetics, something like that. So towards the mid-19th century, the reevaluation of the medieval period was progressively developed, and it is spread among very important philologists and other scholars of great culture, of great erudition. In France, especially, was the architect Viollet-le-Duc that wrote this dictionary of Gothic art, with a very accurate repertoire of all the medieval forms of construction, of building. So this was very important, and it's on the basis of this very solid methodology that he based himself. He based his own work of a restorer of the ancient monuments. As you know, in France, it's full. Everything is. You see much of what you see of medieval. Some of the most iconic French medieval monuments have been restored, also by Viollet-le-Duc. However, Viollet-le-Duc, in this sense, has been relatively criticized because he was inclined, especially in actual practice, to use his repertoire to create fundamentally a sort of perfect picture of medieval architecture that in historical reality had never existed. So this is something that's being said now recently, even to when the accident in Notre Dame and so on, that in fact, because the problem of reconstructing it, because much of also what part of what went lost, unfortunately, was also done by Viollet-le-Duc on models that now probably wouldn't be accepted anymore if they were to be in fact based on a strictly historical fashion, for what we know of French medieval art in general. Think about some of the most important interventions had this aesthetical nature. In fact, think about the restoration of the castle of Pierrefonds, or the citadels of Carcassonne, that respectively in north and the south of France. I was in Carcassonne, by the way. It's beautiful. It really seems to be in a medieval castle. Unfortunately, it's a 19th century castle. That's really the point. But nevertheless, of course, it's definitely inspired to what the original really was. But still, this offers in part a sort of idealized picture of a past that is actually, even from a strictly historical point of view, not at all simple to reconstruct. Because there are people who go there and say, okay, well, I know this is reconstructed, but it's probably reconstructed like it really was. Well, not really. Not really. First of all, because as all readaptations, it's a readaptation. It's not reality, but sometimes because it was, in fact, realized in a fashion that had to get over it, as at least certain problems. Was partly even driven by idealization. Also, these kind of restorations are kind of evident to observe. I mean, you realize, if you have a bit of an eye, you realize that this is not really medieval, from details, from the level of also of how polished it is sometimes. But they are beautiful to watch. But as long as you remind that, if you're aware of its actual how it was realized and why and when also. And in fact, it's kind of relatively easy to spot because it's easily comprehensible through this coherent and unitary interpretation. So you really see that there is a similarity even between the various these various restorations. So briefly about Viollet-le-Duc, the king, Eugène Emmanuel, is his name. Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who was an architect, as we've seen, and also art historian. Actually, he was born in Paris in 1814 and died in Lausanne in 1879. He was definitely one of the major representatives of this movement of Romantic origin that brought into France through the brought in France through the passionate studying of medieval art to the restoration of these ancient monuments. That, by the way, true fashions, we didn't actually say this, in the representation and the sometimes also the completion, fundamentally the conclusion of the various buildings that sometimes actually destroyed the work of previous ages that was actually of great value. This also was done this was done actually many other times in history, that aside from the destructions that happened all the time, including during the Middle Ages, for instance, of ancient monuments, etc., for building other stuff. But actually, even in the 19th century, sometimes to make something new, to restore it, they demolished other parts that were nevertheless of great value, that at the time were not kind of, appreciated, because they said, okay, well, we just document it and it's done, we can get it away. Today we have a wholly different approach to such things. Much more pragmatic from one side, but also much more tending towards the preservation of literally everything we have if we can. And there are very strict laws, unfortunately not always respected still today. This is the sad reality of history. In the world of archaeology, there are actually criminal things that happen. Nobody actually talks about. The archaeological missions normally are, first of all, driven sometimes by people who are completely incompetent. Secondly, they go dig into places where maybe they know there is, I don't know, a Roman ruin, and while they dig, they find, I don't know, there is maybe an early medieval wall. And then what they do, well, you know what? Yeah, there are laws that everything you find in archaeological excavation has to be preserved, etc. But who really knows? Maybe this is just a small wall. Who cares? They demolish it, and nobody reports that. That's a crime. And this happens because this creates problems. The archaeological missions are paid, so also there is this anxiety for finding out something as quick as possible, as effectively as possible. And this kind of crimes actually happen. And I believe that every responsible should be very firmly and very harshly punished, because you can't touch things that come from the past and treating them like rubbish just because you have some money to spend, you bastard. I would beat the shit out of such people if I could. But the idea is this happened, in fact, and it happened under the light of the sun at the time. There's also this other fact to consider, that by renown only, that certain works, especially the cathedrals, etc., began in the High Middle Ages and the Low Middle Ages, were actually never completed, because maybe these works that began in the 13th century, 14th century. Then there is a major crisis, collapse, Black Death, financial crisis, etc. So these cathedrals took decades and decades, well, not generations or centuries, to be built. So sometimes where such cathedrals were actually not completed. And much of what you see in Europe, actually, of the major cathedrals that are standing here, aside from those who were destroyed during World War II, but many of them are actually completed, especially the pinnacles, the towers, etc., in the 19th century, so much later, and with a very different, evidently different style. So some of these restorations actually happen also to complete buildings that the Middle Ages had not finished. So you might say, well, was it necessary? I mean, was it really... I mean, this is an answer that you can give yourself as you like. But just for reminding you that not all you see is medieval, as a matter of fact. Actually, many things. It's actually very difficult to find something that's really medieval, originally speaking. Even in Europe, I mean, yeah, of course, we have a freaking lot, but many castles, many places are actually rebuilt, or maybe naturally were the seat of previous fortresses that, or other buildings that do not exist anymore. That were built over them, or were demolished at the time, or were incorporated, and about which we don't really know even how they looked like for real. So these are all problems you have to take into account, because most of what we have back from medieval times is something like either very wealthy places that had a lot of money to spend. It's obvious that if you go into places like France, that had a very powerful kingdom with lots of resources that could invest into these massive castles and stuff, like you find many castles. In other countries of Europe, it's not really like that. Even in countries like Germany or Italy, there weren't such huge powers that could build such huge things towards the end, if not towards the end of the Middle Ages. So actually, high medieval or early medieval, you can find a relatively few. Well, okay, in Italy maybe there was more continuity with ancient infrastructures, so you find certain things, but nevertheless, it's rare, and therefore be careful about what you consider. Many are also rebuilt, sadly speaking, as we were saying before, also during World War II. Just think about all the German historical centers were almost all bombed and razed to the ground, or destroyed during the fights within the city. So there are very few original standing. Obviously, many countries were rebuilt. Think about, also in Eastern Europe, much has been rebuilt, but in fact it's rebuilt. It's not the original. It's embarrassing sometimes to see, to think that, in fact, that, I mean, embarrassing, no, it's not the proper term. I would say it's devastating to think how it was before, how it's now. It's really, really sad. Nevertheless, certain were actually even active destructions, aside from fires and other accidents. But urbanistically speaking, entire areas of famous cities, ancient cities, were actually razed to the ground to leave space to boulevards, to streets, to monuments, etc. So this happened everywhere, naturally. So that's what modernity brought, in part, sadly enough. And Viollet-le-Duc was also the successor of Mérimée, with the task of a general inspector of national movements and historical antiquities in France. And his name is definitely related. In fact, it's definitely linked to the restoration of so many cathedrals, such as the one of Vézelay, of Amiens, of Chartres, Laon, the Sainte-Chapelle, Notre Dame in Paris, of course, but also, as we were saying before, of the Cité of Carcassonne. And Viollet-le-Duc's writings are also kind of very important because they had an enormous influence. There is the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française du XIe au XVIe siècle, written between 1854 to 1868. Also, les Dictionnaires raisonnés du mobilier français de l'époque carolingienne à la Renaissance, between 1858 and 1875. The Entretien sur l'architecture, 1863-1872. This had a massive importance, in fact, not just on the contemporaries of Viollet-le-Duc, but also for the the construction, I would say, of the modern rationalist architecture in many ways, because this was not just a matter of restoring the old, but also of introducing other other techniques of in engineering, because this was as I remember, it was a rocketing moment for technology. There were so many new materials that, thanks to the industrialization, were now being used. So there was a real transformation in architecture in all the fields. So now there was a great degree of experimentalism, also in kind of testing now what the new materials could achieve if employed. And especially in Viollet-le-Duc's Entretien, that are definitely linked to the experience of teaching that he carried out at l'École des Beaux-Arts in 1863, were and that has been very appreciated by architects like Perret, Berlage, Horta, Wright, Le Corbusier, etc. You can find so many basilar principles of modern architecture and the employment of new materials that are accompanied by the progress in mathematical calculus, the very important role, in fact, of the skeleton of the structure. I mean, the framework, the frame, all this stuff that had to bear all now new weights and so on, as well as the interdependence of structure and decoration. That is very meaningful, because if you want, that had also been a medieval problem. Think about Gothic architecture. Gothic architecture was pioneeristic in many ways, because it wasn't just like a container like in Romanesque art, where you have a massive structure that also has a symbol, but it's fundamentally building. It's meant to be a building, with paintings now framed into these spaces were left for it. The Gothic architecture was something completely new, where the symbol of the universe had to be represented into the wall cathedral as a structure in its colors, and with light, chiefly with true light, and this new very thin. Also think about all the Gothic structure and how we will have to make a video actually on it, because we still haven't touched the issue. I made an entire exam at the time, but it's something very that is based on a very equilibrated relation of forces. So to conclude, I would like to talk about some two Italian currents of that were directly inspired, as a matter of fact, by this new transformations, but these new ideals, fundamentally, both in the field of chiefly in the field of architecture, actually, because something similar happened also in Italy. The French experience of Viollet-le-Duc had a correspondent, let's say, in Italy, in the work of the architects Alfredo d'Andrade, that cared mostly castles of Piedmont and of the Val d'Aote, and Alfonso Rubiani, that instead had a great made a great work in the castles and palaces, public palaces in Emilia. And these were very important, because Rubiani had he was a Bolognese. He actually was born in 1848 in Bologna and died here in 1913. He restored the main Bolognese buildings, from St. Francis to the Palace of King Enzo and the Palace of the Guild of Merchants, fundamentally, the Palace of the Podestà, etc. So also in here the objective was to restore fundamentally the primitive look of these buildings. And also he restored other castles, like the Bentivoglio castle close to Bologna, and also the one of St. Martin in Soverzano, that close to Minerbio. And also he said D'Andrade, he was actually he was a Portuguese Italian. The original name in Portuguese would be De Andrade, and he was also a painter. So also here that he wasn't just an architect but also a painter, and he was born in Lisbon in 1833 and died in Genoa in 1915. He studied in Genoa and in Geneva with Calam, and he here also knew Fontanesi, that he's been another very important Romantic painters in Italy, and he animated the so-called Rivara school, and he was a passion about architecture, medieval architecture in fact, and a follower of Viollet-le-Duc, and in fact was delegated by the local government to the preservation of the monuments of Piedmont, of Liguria, and he also restored the castle of Rivara, collaborating also to the restoration of the castle of Isogne, and he also ideated the reconstruction of medieval burg at the Turin Exposition of 1884. So, yeah, and so these two, let's say, as a general consideration now, the reconstruction and restorations of all these figures was first of all grounded on historical competences, but they brought, at the end of the day, to give paradoxically a 19th century face to great part of the architectural legacy that had survived from the Middle Ages. This is kind of weird, and this is really the point. And this can be said actually for all fields of, not just for architecture. Most of what we see and know and think about the Middle Ages is really, at least it's done through categories that have been created into the 19th century. Not that previously, Europeans had not thought about the Middle Ages. On the contrary, but they had done it in a, if you want, in a much more natural way. For instance, well, now it's another big topic, maybe for another time. But even in the now we have seen naturally the kind of the praising side of the Middle Ages that, however, caused this very weird result of transforming medieval legacy into cultural legacy in a sort of 19th era contemporary one in look. But even though, the main criticism that we have toward medieval history actually comes from, not even from the Enlightenment, it actually came from positivism. Because in the Enlightenment, it's difficult to talk actually expressly of a critique of medieval civilization as such. I mean, definitely there were certain aspects that were naturally condemned, chiefly at an ideological level of knowledge of science, etc. But it was more of a sort of political and social criticism due to the fact that now the Ancien Regime that had crystallized incidentally more at the end of the Middle Ages and in the modern age than in the full Middle Ages, now involved these scholars, these thinkers, into kind of creating a sort of middle class, comeback that brought to the revolutions, etc. But the real contempt toward the Middle Ages, so this idiotic idea that unfortunately still flows around all over, was actually mostly a 19th century one, where people were hyped because they had discovered new technologies. Whoa, and therefore, yeah, we don't live in that sewer that the previous centuries are. We are progress now. We are civilized now. The Middle Ages, blah. What is that? That was their prevalent thinking, and that's where I think it was much more aggressive, because it's much more pushed by direct expansion. It wasn't just a pure reflection. It was simply saying, okay, now we fundamentally have a sort of we can't really quantify our progress, because that also was the obsession of the various the positivism in many ways, but the general impact it was devastating on our society. And even in this sense, even those who praise the Middle Ages basically made another work that was exfoliating the ancient buildings of the signs of the progressive modifications that they had underwent in the course of time, and therefore giving back to the following generations an ideal picture of Middle Ages was fundamentally reinvented into the 19th century. So we have to be aware of this, because fundamentally we still live in the 19th century. I mean, I believe, especially from a political and ideological point of view, we still live in that world. We still live in those categories of nation state, mass society, of love for progress, not even for science in itself, because that's the thing, loving progress without knowing science, because that's ultimately what we are. Not understanding what science really is, or how it should be handled, or what its limits are, etc. And therefore not understanding what it is. So this spasmodic need for growth, for expansion, this obsession that if you don't grow one, taught points in percentage, it's a disaster, that you can't. You just have to grow. This was the obsession of the of industrialization. Fundamentally, the fact that you had to produce even more, because it's just quantity that matters, not quality. Well, medieval times, in this sense, in my opinion, were a much more thoughtful moment than the one we are now. Because today we have so much to think about, actually, but in proportion we are not able to do it anymore. Of course, it's difficult. It's not that our times have to be thrown away. We have difficulties that derive, in fact, from problems that in the Middle Ages did not exist. But nevertheless, that's the point. One thing is, dealing with our own problems. Another thing is venting fundamentally against other ages that also allowed us to be the place we are now, the point we are now, even in progress, if you accept progress as a real thing, which I don't personally, but we kind of improved by certain standards. We live better. We are in a better world, also thanks to the Middle Ages. And I've made several videos now about the topic. You can find in medieval society, or in a playlist on the historian one, that are kind of reflections on all these problems. So today we will not touch them, because we have finished now to talk about the main topic. But it's nevertheless fundamental to observe these periods and say, okay, we have to understand where we came from, how this developed, not thinking that now we are in a suspended age in time that is perfect on its own, that it has no basis, that came from nowhere. We are still in movement. We are still progressing, and we are progressing from a world that has always been, progressing here I'm using as a neutral. We're kind of evolving, or transforming, we prefer. From moments that we're struggling as much as we do, if not more than us. So it's very difficult sometimes to realize this, and that's why without history you can't. That's why at the beginning of the video I was making that point about reenactment, what people think about it, how they see history, because even in 2019, where in medieval history, in the Middle Ages, the idea of being able to write and read, for instance, was something that everybody kind of craved for. I mean, maybe the peasant didn't even know what the advantages were, but being a schooled person and a literate at that time meant you would do a freaking beautiful career. Naturally, today is kind of the norm, despite there are people who are still illiterate functionally in some ways. But I mean, we struggled for having knowledge at hand for millennia, and nobody cares anymore. So we are kind of letting everything go. This seems really the point to me. It's not that society does not progress, because there are always people who are kind of struggling for seizing more. But what I'm worried about are the masses, because this is a moment in history that, in my opinion, is really, bringing the masses up maybe from, those basic living standards that you need. We know it. Poverty is, is decreasing in... extreme poverty is very much decreasing. Fortunately, it's exponential, we can say. But what about the quality of our lives, even from a mere, intellectual speed? My fear is that we will arrive to a sort of apathic death, for which we have everything we need, and we don't need to struggle anymore. We don't need to think anymore. And next thing we have to struggle is really with our minds. It's not really with our muscles, fortunately, but at the same time we have this tendency of delaying the effort fundamentally, and saying, okay, but I'm too tired, I don't want now, and and it becomes fundamentally too difficult to even think about it, because you don't care. That's the real point. We don't care. And in fact, we are going back to tribalism in many ways, exactly for this reason, because we don't need to think through things and to associate in complex fashions that can solve problems, etc. We just say, okay, now it's how I feel, that matters, not what I should do, not how I could improve factually my world, to help myself and consequently the others. No, just sitting there, eating garbage and staying glued to your smartphone and nothing else. And this is pretty upsetting in many ways. And according to me, we're some, maybe, I don't know, I'm obsessed also by progress myself. Who knows? But I still think there can be improvement. I don't care about progress. I don't care about progress as a mere macroeconomical datum. I care about how you arrive to that, fundamentally. Also, because if you squeeze too much, fundamentally you make the whole system collapse. So you have to structure patiently. We need to learn the value of patience, of hard work, of things that take time to be achieved. Well, in the Middle Ages, this was much clearer than today. Today we want everything and fast. And we want it, why? Because you breathe. That's kind of the most selfish attitudes that exist. People work hard for deserving things. That's also why certain political, movements are kind of rising again from what after the Soviet Union we hoped would have remained to ashes. No. Why? Because this idea that if I breathe, therefore I deserve. This is kind of most stupid and selfish attitudes and most socially destructive ideas that can ever exist. If you want something, you have to work hard and get in it. The rest is nothing. If you want to steal other people's work, you're a criminal. Point. That's it. So it's not in the Middle Ages people didn't steal other people's works. Of course, they spent all their lives fighting and so on. But even in there, it was more dictated by actual very logical dynamics that as I was saying today, that even what seems like stealing was actually framed into definitely a system that was not very happy to be in. You would have not very happy to live in, but because it was unjust, definitely, but it still responded to certain dynamics that were much more inescapable than the ones that are today. I mean, today, if you want to work, you can. At the time, well, you may even work, but not making it, so that you were pushed to do other things, which is bad, but they kind of worked for that context. So, however, and this was just a very plain introduction. I remember I made a university exam, not really on these topics we discussed today, but in part it was mainly about Viollet-le-Duc and Neo-Gothic revival in architecture. It was a part of an exam on cathedrals, actually, and I remember that the problem is much wider than this. So this is just very, very light, very superficial approach, just for saying, look, these things existed, be mindful of it. Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.